gun rights. And the Supreme Court said, well, you do have an individual right to bear arms, but no right is absolute. No right in the Constitution is absolute. For example, free speech. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, yes, but you can't yell fire in a crowded room when there's no fire. So there are limits. And that's the beauty of our country, that we begin to have this discussion and that it goes to that final authority. And certainly they have to take some of those things into consideration. And you're going to have scholars who are going to be able to make reasonable arguments on both sides. That's what makes us America. Now, and secondly, you mentioned a couple of cases that were overturned by the Supreme Court. Today is a different day. So we have to have a different way of approaching this issue. That's another thing that makes this country great. However, in order to maintain that greatness, President-elect Trump talks about making America great again. What could make America great again is a citizenry that's informed, takes interest in it, and that we become a nation of citizens rather than consumers.
Very, very important. Yes, citizenry, I think, is the key. As Louis Brandeis, a contemporary of Oliver Wendell Holmes. You know, Louis Brandeis, who was born in 1841 in Cincinnati, Ohio, but he was educated in Germany as a youth and came back to this country, became one of the most important advocates for the labor unions, and was appointed to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson in 1916. Interesting, because he's the first Jew on the United States Supreme Court, and Woodrow Wilson was pretty much of a racist. He called Italian immigrants, my grandparents, cursed rabble.
And of course, Wilson thought that Birth of a Nation was the greatest film, greatest movie ever.
They reissued it after 100 years, a new version of it. I think I'm anxious to see that. But you're absolutely right that the Supreme Court has evolved itself just as our nation has evolved. It has declared laws unconstitutional, laws that were long-standing. Now, Trump, for example, is saying he's going to appoint justices that will try to overturn Roe versus Wade, the women's right to choice. Now, how do you think our country would respond to the overturning of something as monumental, as pivotal as that in terms of women's rights?
Well, of course, you know, Roe versus Wade has been very important to the women's rights movement. It's been part of our Constitution, actually, because of the decision in Roe versus Wade. And there's been a lot of talk about putting members of the putting people on the Supreme Court who would argue against that and decide against it or in some way change it. And obviously, if that happened, I would anticipate, you know, people being very upset. But again, an informed citizen, we would say, okay, you got your way this time, but as citizens, we have recourse to methods that we can employ to change even that, because that's exactly what the pro-life lobby has done. They've taken a look at Roe v. Wade, and they understand that in our constitutional framework, the way to turn that around is to appoint lawyers, judges to the Supreme Court who will be able to reasonably and rationally make a case to change it. So what do you have to do? You have to again advocate for judges that will have an opposite view. You know, our country and the problems we faced, right now, I think you can say that there are some very, very, very bitter debates on issues. Sometimes they devolve down into personalities. But again, my hope, and the hope of others too, is that patriots and citizens will engage in dialogue, and they'll accept different points of view, and they'll see that the most important thing is that the Constitution still stands. The worst thing is that we ignore it, and that would be a sad, sad day. So am I hopeful for the future? Absolutely. Absolutely. As long as the Constitution is still the basis for the way we live, I'm optimistic. I'm not going to be optimistic about the future if the way we live is predicated on the opinions and personal characteristics of a single person.
Good point. Very, very good point. You know, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and we talked extensively about some of them today, but that 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment, which says that any power not granted to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are reserved for the states, reserved powers. Now, the issue there throughout much of our history was not states' rights, which is a valid and timely issue today as then, but state sovereignty. And that was resolved by the American Civil War, that no state is a sovereign state. You still hear it. You will hear the sovereign state of Texas and the sovereign state of South Carolina. But there is no such thing as state sovereignty any longer. But states' rights is a very, very viable and important issue today. And yet we find the movement to making states' rights more important than federal government rights. And I think that is an issue that we also have to be concerned about. You know, so how is your take on the reserve powers of the states? Do you think that the states should have more power? Should override much of it? Of course, the Constitution is supreme, the supreme law of the land, and federal law takes precedent over state law. But yet we hear these little threats of maybe Texas should secede from the Union. Maybe South Carolina should not agree or not actually implement some of the federal laws. Like you pointed out, Andrew Jackson, very important example. Andrew Jackson said, the United States Supreme Court has passed an interpretation of the law, now let them enforce it. He was not going to enforce it. So, we only have a few seconds left, Peter. What would you say about that issue of voter suppression by the states? As we've seen examples in many of the states, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In quick 20 seconds, can you give us your take on states' rights versus the power of the federal government?
Yeah, very, very quickly, when the founders put together the Constitution, it was the United States of America. They had in mind a federal republic in which there was a central authority, and then there were the constituent states that made up the group, the federation, that had their own powers. Over time, and the Civil War, we've moved towards a stronger central authority in which federal law, of course, there's so many federal laws that impact the states. And that's the key constitutional issue that we're going to have to resolve, among others.
Peter, we're out of time. I feel really very, very good that you were a student of mine and that I was not a complete failure.
And I got bare arms, too.
So, thanks for being